class person in the early 21st century U.S. You have less than half the chance of dying as an infant compared to an African American.
The white median family has 10 times as much wealth, that's assets minus debts, compared to African American family.
Young white males have 1/5 the chance of being under correctional supervision compared to African Americans.
There are advantages in education, inheritance, employment, housing, health and health care, and retirement. The median family income for white people is about 40% higher than for African Americans.
The lives that the majority of people live in the United States remain largely separate and unequal.
I want protection for our children. I don't want to have to fear that my 12-year-old son will be murdered just for being black. I want justice. I want the cops to do their job and not abuse their power. Serve and protect. That is their job, not murder. I want the cover-up to stop. There was no fourth man. And no more drinking on the job. I want accountability in the police department. Let them be held responsible for murder.
Julia, can you talk a little bit about the relationship of racism to capitalism?
Well, capitalism basically came about when Europeans went out and conquered many other nations of the world that were darker-skinned peoples. They conquered them, they enslaved them and brought them thousands of miles away from their homeland. They stole their resources. They destroyed their native industries to be able to supplant them with their own industries, as when the British cut off the hands of the Indian handloom weavers because their textile industry wasn't yet developed enough to beat them by honest competition. So to justify this, there needed to be an ideology, and that ideology was that the peoples of color were less than human and only white people were fully human. And again, the concept of white people did not actually exist till the 1600s, the concept of Caucasians until the 1700s. These were new ideas that were brought about to justify the inequality and the horrible barbaric conquest that had been perpetrated. And in addition, this served the function of getting, as Chip was just explaining, a section of the exploited people in the European and, quote, white countries to identify with the ruling classes rather than with people of color who were also exploited. So it served in that sense to help destroy the opposition to the system.
Reconstruction was the period immediately following the U.S. Civil War, which resulted in great gains and ultimately great losses for African Americans. Its importance is largely ignored or misunderstood. Chip, can you give us an overview and talk about the key characteristics of that period?
Reconstruction was from 1865 to 1877, and then with kind of aftershocks that went all the way up to the year 1900. And particularly the 10-year period there, or 11-year period from 1865 to 1877 was a time of really revolutionary ferment. It went from, at first, President Johnson trying to reinstate the plantation ruling class in the South, together with Democratic. Back then, the Democrats were the pro-slavery party. Things have changed in 150 years. But he tried to build a coalition that would reinstate the plantation owners. But the grassroots opposition, the organizing, the ferment that grew up from the newly freed slaves, and the organizing that people did, and the help to, along with supporters in the Union League in the North and white working class people who had been won over to the struggle against slavery in the course of the Civil War, in the course of the old plantation ruling class coming to the fore. There were riots attacking black people in Memphis and in New Orleans. And then also during this period, there was a reign of terror against grassroots organizers among the freed black people, so that night riders would be, there was also an institution of the black codes, which attempted to put black people back into the same labor conditions they had been in before, but this time not calling it slavery. The counter to this eventually resulted in congressional Reconstruction, and with that, the overturning of the plantation owners in the South. They were removed from government. The federal troops were in a position to enforce new conditions in which black people had the right to vote, where black people were elected into office, particularly in the what they call the Black Belt states, running from South Carolina to Louisiana. But then, in time, the Republican Party, which was at heart a party controlled by, and eventually did become controlled by, the large industrial interests in the North, began to move away from supporting the democratic rights of the newly freed slaves, and instead, eventually by the mid-'70s, was willing to make a compromise by which they held power as the president, but in doing so, they gave political power in the South across the board to the Democrats. And so from that point on, black people had to struggle on a much more limited basis to maintain some control over the conditions in their lives. In North Carolina, in the 1890s, there was a fusion effort that put Republicans in power, including black people in offices at the county level, as sheriffs and tax collectors and so on, which ultimately ended up being suppressed by the Wilmington riot in 1898, which has been in the news in recent years.
The labor movement in the U.S. excluded African Americans and women for many years. Can you talk about that exclusion and its impact on the ability of the movement to achieve its demands with regard to the American Federation of Labor and other organizations like the Knights of Labor, in terms of how these organizations dealt with the fundamental question of who to organize and how to organize?
Well, the first major labor organization after the Civil War was the National Labor Union, and they were exclusionary from the start, but and then the colored National Labor Union began to take form in the late 1860s, and there was some movement toward a joint working together, but the racism of the white workers put a barrier to that. They wouldn't want, at a convention, one of the organizers for the Union League, which was pro-Reconstruction organization, wasn't allowed to be seated at the National Labor Union convention. And ultimately what happened there was the National Labor Union tried to connect with a break-off of the Republican Party called the Liberal Republicans, and they ran Horace Greeley in 1872 and lost badly. But the point of it is that the National Labor Union, the white workers there, opted more to try to build ties with the Republican business people than they were willing to connect with the freed slaves. And that pattern continued. Labor, by and large, identified with the Democratic Party, which was a white man's party, all during the latter part of the 1800s. Now, there were two trends within the labor movement then, and really continued for another 80 years, but they took the form of the Knights of Labor, which grew up in the 1870s, which organized on an industry-wide basis, versus craft unions, which would take a particularly skilled craft, like people who worked on on the railroads, or who were tool and die makers and other craft workers, and just organize that particular craft. And that grouping is what formed the American Federation of Labor in the early 1880s. So that tension between an industrial base of organizing, where you bring everybody in an industry compared to the American Federation of Labor's focus on craft workers, was a tension that continued on into the 20th century. But the Knights of Labor had something of a hands-off attitude when it came to actual struggle at the workplaces. If workers would get together and contest with the owners, they'd come in behind them. But by and large, they discouraged that kind of like strike activity and so on. Meanwhile, the AFL did the right thing in which is the American Federation of Labor, did the right thing in the 1880s by calling for a big mass strike on May Day of May 1st of 1886, from which May Day has originated. And meanwhile, the Knights of Labor was trying to keep arm's length from that. But the fact is, it was a very successful demonstration, but then that whole movement was crushed in the following years, first by a bomb being thrown by a provocateur, then the hanging of 4 anarchist leaders of the labor movement, and then what became later in the 1950s 50s called red baiting, where the unions would go hunting for communists. Well, the counterpart back then was anarchists, and the Knights of Labor destroyed itself by rooting out anarchists who were actually rank-and-file leaders who had following. I mean, a particular example of that was in New Mexico with Chicano organizing there. And eventually the Knights of Labor became an out-and-out racist party, calling for black people to be returned to Africa. Meanwhile, the AFL took hold because of the rise of the new industries, the robber barons, the development of the kind of skilled trades that the AFL organized. It was able to sustain itself, but at the expense of having organizing was actually class-wide, including workers of color. So they had a barrier that excluded black people. They were reluctant to organize women until women walked out in the early 20th century and organized themselves, and it was the first working class organization that actually came out as being pro-capitalist, and just argued for getting a piece of the pie was the kind of the slogan they went by.
Chinese immigrants were vilified and subject to deportation, doing a lot of agricultural work that is commonly associated with Mexican workers today. Following the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, growers recruited Japanese and Mexican immigrants and subcontractors who organized them to fill the gap left by the excluded Chinese workers. Can you talk a little bit about that situation and what lessons it has for us?
Well, probably the key struggle that captures, I think, some of the issues you're raising was in Oxnard, California, a strike of beet workers there, and the company that controlled the farms set up its own subcontracting mechanism, whereas before there would be subcontractors who would bring workers into and work the fields. And so the growers wanted to take those subcontractors out of the picture. So they set up their own subcontracting organization. As a result of that, the subcontractors were totally angered by this move, and they had ties with the workers who they brought to the jobs. And between them, Mexican and Japanese alike, they went on strike. And they were looking for support from the, and they got support from the Los Angeles Central Labor Council, and eventually were able to win the strike and gain increase in wages and have the subcontracting go back to its former way of being organized. But then when the Japanese-Mexican Labor Association asked to become part of the American Federation of Labor, the head of it, Samuel Gompers, refused to allow them to come in unless the Japanese were excluded from the union, and the Mexican workers refused to go along with that, and stood by their co-workers who they struggled together with. Unfortunately, as a result of that, the other official AFL labor people would not line up and support the Japanese Mexican Labor Association. As a result, it was eventually became a non-factor in the relations between the workers and the owners in the fields.
In your book, The Cost of Privilege, you describe what you call the Sunbelt strategy, which calls for the left and progressive forces to put a lot of resources into organizing in the South and Southwest. Why there and not the North?
The main underpinning of this strategic approach to where we feel the left should center its organizing work goes way back. It goes back to the Reconstruction period and the defeat of Reconstruction. It goes back to the organizing among tenant workers in the South in the 1930s. And it goes back to the failure of Operation Dixie after World War II to organize, to follow through on the organizing successes of the 1930s and during World War II. And then the upshot was the passage of the Taft-Hartley Bill in 1948 and the open shop that was part of that, and the right to work, which has undermined the ability of unions to represent all the workers in the workplace in the South based on a majority election. That lack of organizing of the workers in the South underlay the low wage levels of that area. It underlay the closing of plants in the North heading to the South. In industry leaders kind of groped their way to a strategy of shutting down what became called the Rust Belt of the North, Midwest and North, and moving plants to the South and Southwest. And that's also where the military has its bases. And so the center of the economy moved to the part of the country which was the least organized. It was also the part of the country that is the homeland of the historically the homeland of African Americans in the Southwest of the Chicano people. If we are about transforming the system, if we are about national liberation, getting rid of white supremacy and racism, having working people be able to build a future in which they run, democratically run the country, if we're about that kind of major transformation of the country, then it makes sense to base the organizing amongst the oppressed nations of the South and Southwest and build the kind of organization that's needed to take on the industrial heartland that exists there now. I mean, so, and then you look at the history of the civil rights movements, started in the South, and its impact broadly across the country shows that when organizing does take place there, it has a way of impacting the whole country. And so our feeling is that conscious folks who are committed to transforming the system should be thinking about moving to the South and Southwest and connecting up with the organizing that's going on there.
4 chapters of the book are dedicated to the topic of the patriarchy, which you define as the systematic limitation and control by men of women's sexuality, reproductive capability, labor, social roles, and political participation. How do you respond to those that question the validity of this focus on race and gender and say, doesn't all of this talk about race and identity politics divide people? Those on the right say it isn't an issue, and on the left, some say that class issues are what's central to the transformation of U.S. society. Can you talk about these different views?
I'm a member of a union, right? I'm a member of the United Federation of Teachers as a public school social worker. Now, my union has a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender caucus. It also has African American caucus, I think what they call a Hispanic caucus. Now, to me, and my union is not particularly any great model of democracy, but it at least formally recognizes that if you want to have a united organization of working people, it's very important that people get to express and get support for their other identities and oppressions in that organization. So, for example, I'm saying that even in a labor union situation, you strengthen the union if you acknowledge racial oppression and build solidarity between the whites and those who are racially oppressed. And just another example of that, I have a friend who's a transit worker. He's a very pale, red-headed Irish guy, actually. And there was a situation where an African-American transit worker was beaten by the police. There were protests organized about this by Al Sharpton and other members of the black community in New York City. My friend particularly focused on getting some of the transit workers and some of the white transit workers to come to this protest. And in that way, they would show their support. And this, rather than dividing the union by acknowledging that some people do face issues of racism or sexism, this actually strengthens it and I think enables the people with those special oppressions to see a union as a vehicle that advances their own interests and to see it as a place with other people who care about them. So that's just, I address that from the working class standpoint of how acknowledging race and gender strengthens a united movement rather than weakening it.
Can you talk about the contributions and shortcomings of second wave feminism and what it means for today?
The second wave feminism started just as I was getting into college, and it was a wonderful thing for me. I mean, just the idea that the personal is political, that intimate relationships should be subject to critique and scrutiny and public discussion and democratic norms. I mean, that was a very liberating thing. The repeal of the laws against abortion, the right to a safe legal abortion, and that if you accidentally got pregnant, you didn't either have to have the kid or risk death at the age of 19. I mean, this is a very important achievement on the state-by-state level. The idea that housework should not be the exclusive burden of women similarly, and there were huge gains in consciousness and practice that came out of this. Now, the main weakness was that the movement was principally white-led and white-dominated, and middle and upper class-led and dominated. And this meant that it didn't adequately address issues in lives of the majority of women. And just to give one example of that, I mentioned the right to abortion as an enormous victory for all women, which it definitely was. Yet women in certain communities, for example in Puerto Rico, were subject to another form of oppression through forced sterilization, as were women with mental disabilities and black women at different times in history. Now, the National Abortion Rights Action League didn't want to take on this issue of forced sterilization because they were afraid that it could limit the right to sterilization for women who actually did want that. Predominantly one assumes the white and middle class women in their base. So that was a limitation. Now, there were small groups that attempted to go beyond this that I and friends of mine were in. There's a group called the Coalition for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse. And this was a group of anti-imperialist women that tried to combine the issues, and in particular in solidarity with Puerto Rico, where there were huge abuses going on at that time and it was coming to light. But that trend was not the dominant one in the movement, and it very much fell into its white and middle class limitations.
One of the chapters that deals with the subject of patriarchy puts forth the concept of intersectionality. Juliet, can you talk about that?
Intersectionality is the recognition that people in their lives live multiple forms of oppressions and resistance in their own life. And that the political implication of it is that in order to build stronger movements and united movements and movements that people can pour their passion into, that we need to recognize intersectionality in our organizing. And in a way, the example of the transit worker that I gave does address that. But I could think also of a struggle that I was involved in around a curriculum called the Children of the Rainbow, where the New York City Department of Education for once did a good thing and said, put out this curriculum that mentioned a book called Heather Has Two Mommies, which said that people could have two mommies or two daddies or grandma, and it was all family. Well, the right wing started to use this as a wedge issue. And what they particularly did was to try to pit working class black and Latino people who were the parents in the public school system against gay people who they portrayed as white and all upper class and middle class. And this was very bitter. A friend of mine, a Jamaican-American teacher, helped to start a response to this right-wing wedge attack. And one of the things that he did was to bring out the voices of people who were working class and black and also gay or lesbian and have kids. And by recognizing this intersectionality of people's lives, you don't allow the right wing to pit people against each other so easily.
Chip and Juliet, you're both socialists, and the book talks about the need to bring about socialism. But the history of socialism has been checkered with great successes, but ultimately in most countries where it's been established, there's emerged a new class which has appropriated for itself the mantle of the people and created a new leadership class that got extra privileges. Is there a way that a socialist-oriented mass movement can ensure that that it and the socialist society it produces won't be co-opted and become a dictatorship?
I think there are certain things that we learn from the past. For example, just nationalizing property isn't enough to actually make the majority of the people who work really the masters of society, because you can have a class of bureaucrats who control the nationalized property. Just saying that women should work outside the home and women should have the right to, which was a great gain, especially in semi-feudal cultures, is not enough to liberate women. You need also to put out the idea that women don't have to do the double day, that also the work at home is something that men should share. But also, I think we learn that you can't trust that there's going to be one party which is all-knowing and has all wisdom contained and within it and knows what's best for everybody's liberation, so that you need actual autonomous organizations of women and black people and Dominican American people and Native Americans and other oppressed people, actual free autonomous mass organizations for people to think through what we want our liberation to be, not for the all-knowing party to tell us.